Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Taibi. As Rose told you, I come from the railroad station in Munnsville, which is an O&W station. And a week or so ago, I was here with Zach. We were setting up the logistics of the sound and all that kind of stuff. And I mentioned to Rose that I believe this is the 5th time that I've spoken for the Clinton Historical Society. But it's the first time that I'm here and the benches aren't here. So you're all much more comfortably seated. I thought that I would also like to let you know that I'd like to dedicate today's program to Philip E. Munson. There's a plaque on this bookshelf right here. Phil Munson was a past president of the Clinton Historical Society, and he and some other fellows used to come visit me at my station all the time, and I used to visit him here in Clinton. He was a wonderful guy, and on my way here today, I turned up Franklin Avenue and I went past the Sunset Hills Cemetery. And the reason I did that was, I'll talk about it during the course of the program, is that the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton president, as well as the Roman Clinton president, are both buried there. And where Phil is buried, his spot is right between the two of them. They can eyeball each other all the time, and I thought, my God, what a wonderful spot he's got. I don't know how he arranged that or if he did it on purpose, but good for him, he did. So for those of you that knew Phil, let's keep him in mind. For those of you that didn't know Phil, he was a wonderful guy. We're going to talk about railroading around the town of Kirkland today, and I believe it's been 50-something or 60-something years since a railroad wheel turned in the town. The last railroad to survive in the town of Kirkland was the West Shore Railroad, and that abandoned in 1964. So it's been a while since there has been railroading in the town. But previous to that, there was a diverse amount of railroading within the town. Steam trains, diesel-powered trains, electrified third rail trains. There was trolley cars like this Clinton line trolley you see here. And by the way, I don't know about all of you, but this is the only color picture that I've ever seen of one of the Utica and Mohawk Valley Clinton line cars. You see the number 3. That was the Utica and Mohawk Valley's designation for the Clinton line. So when I got this color picture, I thought, boy, that's the dandy thing to use for the opening frame of this picture. It's taken just outside the town of Kirkland, but you wouldn't know that if I didn't tell you, so let's keep it a secret. So we're going to talk about the O&W Railroad, the West Shore Railroad, the electrified third rail, and also the Utica and Mohawk Valley trolley line. But there was a few other smaller railroads within the town of Kirkland too that we're going to get to. These are the fellows that brought railroading to the town of Kirkland. In the middle you have John Butterfield. John Butterfield was quite an influential person nationwide as far as railroading and express goes, because he was one of the founders of many of the early express companies. He was a stage operator, and John Butterfield was instrumental in developing many of the railroads that emanated out of Utica. He was the president of the Utica City Railroad when the railroad opened up to Kirkland and Clinton, September 3rd, 1866. The fellow next to him is Othniel Williams. He was the president. He became the president after Butterfield's death, and he was the first president of the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton Railroad. The fellow on the other side is DeWitt Littlejohn. He was the president of the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad, which was the predecessor to the later day New York, Ontario, and Western Railroad. And they are the fellows that helped to bring railroading into and out of the town of Kirkland. The only fellow that I don't have a picture of is William Bartlett, but we acknowledge him here nevertheless. And William Bartlett and Othniel Williams, of course, are the two that Phil is buried right next to. This is a chart of the progression of railroading that came into and out of the town of Kirkland. Don't bother trying to read it all. I'll narrow it all down in a nutshell for you. Like all railroads in the 1860s, when they got their start, none of them had any money. So they quickly changed names, a different corporation came and went, and then if they ran out of money, then it was reorganized again. To make a long story short, the railroad that came from Utica to Clinton, originally the Utica City Railroad, then the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton Railroad, and then the O&W Railroad came along in 1886. But in between the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton, and the O&W, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company owned the railroad. And I'm not going to get into all the corporate ins and outs and everything else, otherwise we'll be here until the cows come home, and we certainly don't want to do that. But because of the fact that the New York and Oswego Midland went bankrupt in 1876, the Delaware and Hudson that had guaranteed the operation of the line with the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton took over the railroad and operated it for 10 years along with the Lackawanna Railroad. So there is a lot of different things that happened corporate-wise, but for all intents and purposes, the line that became the O&W took hold in 1886. When the Shenango Canal came to Clinton, this was a warehouse that was built along the side of the canal to serve the canal's purposes for transporting goods into and out of Clinton. When the railroad came along, they took over that building, and it became an eyesore to the community. And we have to remember that back in these days, when a community got a railroad, and believe me, there was not many communities that didn't want to have a railroad, they prided themselves on having an attractive station because the people that rode past it on a train would judge the community by the appearance of the station. Well, this station certainly didn't give a good impression for Clinton. But nevertheless, the station languished for almost 18 years before the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company built a new station in 1884. That tells us what the sign says on the side of the building, that it was born in 1847, it died of old age, May 26, 1884, and it was retired, because that was the day that the new station that was built by the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company opened. Why did the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company build a new station for Clinton as opposed to the Lackawanna or the Midland or the later day Ontario and Western? It's because they wanted to get out from underneath operating the railroad. So they were making the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton line more attractive for the O&W Railroad to take over. And they were successful in doing that because 2 years later, on June 1st, 1886, the O&W took over the operation of the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton Railroad. One footnote for this particular building is, you can see the last line, it says it was dismantled by George King during March of 1944. George King, when he was a kid, helped paint the station when it was new. So he helped paint it when it was built, and then he ended up tearing it down quite a few years later. Of course, he was much older at the time too. This is a picture that I wished I had for my book, Rails Along the Oriskany. Just out of curiosity, are there any people in the audience that know about my book, Rails Along the Oriskany? Okay. Rails Along the Oriskany was written about the entire Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton and the Roman Clinton Railroad. And there's copies of it at the Town of Kirkland Library if you're curious to read it, because during this presentation I can't tell you everything that it says, but one of the things that I try to do in all of the books that I've written, and by the way, my 17th book has just came out last week, is I try to perpetuate the memory of the people who worked for the railroads, because railroadings would be nothing if it wasn't for station agents, locomotive engineers, the people that worked on the railroad. Well, in this particular picture, there's three noteworthy people, and this is John Fagan, was the engineer. He became an engineer on this line when he was 19 years old. As a comparison, do you know of any 19-year-old astronauts? Because that is what a locomotive engineer was thought of back in these days. So at 19, he became a locomotive engineer, and he became the most senior engineer on this line. This fellow right here, that's Jack Axel. He was the conductor. Prior to the building of the railroad, he was a stage coach driver, and he ran the stage between Clinton and Hamilton, maybe even New Hartford and Hamilton, I forget offhand, but when the railroad came along, he became the conductor for the line, and he and John Fagan worked hand in hand for many, many years. And this fellow right here, that's Joe Ewan. He was Clinton's longtime station agent. He was the station agent in the barracks depot, which is what they called the first station. And then when the new station was built, he became the first station agent. And I believe he was the station agent at Clinton for 51 years. Much like Othniel Williams and William Bartlett and Phil Munson, he's also buried in the Sunset Hill Cemetery. This is a southbound mail train coming into the Clinton station, and the fellow in the foreground, he's got the mail bag, and he's getting ready to put mail on the train when it stops and obviously take mail off. I did a program at the Morrisville Library last Friday, a different program than this, and after the program was over, I asked if anybody had any questions, and there was a woman in the audience, and she said, well, back in the old days, what did they need railroads for? Well, I very rarely am at a loss for words. But I told her, and I'll tell you and remind you, that back in these days, everything that a community needed or was being shipped out from the community came and went on the railroad. The mail came and went, dental supplies came and went, books for the schools came and went, everything in the community. The community relied on the railroad station. And I get a lot of folks that come to visit my station in Munnsville, which is now in a little bit of a residential area because houses have grown up. And they look around and they say, well, gee, there really wasn't anything here. And I say, well, you got to remember back in the day, this was where everything was. If you wanted to know what was going on in the community, you went to the railroad station. It's where people, fellas went off to war. If they got killed, it's where their bodies came home to. People got all their supplies, all their telegraph news. So what this fellow in the foreground is doing with the mail, that was an important thing for the community because people used to hang out at the post office just like the railroad stations, so that they were the first ones to get their mail. And you might also notice in this picture is that right here, it's partially obscured by these bushes, but there's an O&W logo there. The O&W Railroad had a fellow that worked out of Norwich. All he did was maintain the station grounds by planting flowers and making decorative logos like that one that you see there. This is another view of the station, still looking north. This was a unique station because there was a room for the baggage, and then there was a larger room for the waiting room and the station agent, and in between there was a breezeway. Right? This was the sign for the Clinton station, and right through here, there was a breezeway that went out from the railroad track to the adjacent street. This building in the background, that was the freight house. That's the only building that still survives from the railroad days in Clinton, except it's not there anymore. They moved it back by the apartments. What's the name of the apartments?
Clinton House.
Does anyone?
Clinton House.
I put her on the spot.
Clinton House.
Okay, Clinton House Apartments. The Clinton House Apartments, they moved the building back and they use it for a garage so people can park their automobiles in it. And that's where I used to visit Phil too, in Clinton.
There's a model of that downstairs.
Okay. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the freight house a little later on. This is an aerial view of Clinton. And I'd like to tell people that I love aerial views. I like to be able to look down at things and see all the specific little things that used to be in all these pictures. When I die, I hope I go up so I can look down. Because I will not be happy if I'm down and have to look up. This is a picture during the latter day of the O&W Railroad. The station had been located right here. And right up here is a spot called Rome Branch Junction. That was the junction between the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton and the Rome and Clinton Railroad. That is where the trains that were going to Rome branched off from the line that was going to Utica. This line is for Utica. That line goes to Rome. The Rome passenger trains were nicknamed the Peanut. They were 3 cars with a little steam engine. They operated back and forth as many as 6 times a day during the heyday years between Clinton and Rome. And they got their start at the Clinton station, and then off they went to Rome Branch Junction, and then got on the Rome and Clinton Railroad. The other interesting things in this particular picture is that, and we're going to see examples of it in a little bit, there were 2 smaller railroads in the town of Kirkland that had to do with the iron manufacturing. There was the Franklin Iron Manufacturing Company spur, the old Franklin Iron Works, and then there was a spur to the Clinton Hematite mine. And they were long gone in this picture, but this curve right here is the roadbed for the old line that went to the Clinton Hematite mine. And this curve right here is the curve that went to the Franklin Iron Works mine. I'm sure you've all heard at one time in the history of Clinton that hematite ore was the big thing. There was a vein of ore that started in Alabama. It ran all the way up through central New York and went out to the Niagara Escarpment, and the richest veins were right here in Clinton. And at one time during the history of the United States and Clinton, it was thought that Clinton would become the iron capital of the United States. But as years wore on and better analysis were done, the ore was not quite the high grade that they originally expected. Nevertheless, the Franklin Iron Works, the Clinton Hematite Mine, and also the Clinton Metallic Paint Company all did a lot of business by mining hematite ore. The Clinton Metallic Paint Company, what they did with their ore was they pulverized it to such a fine degree that it would not go through a sieve. And the reason for that was because the pieces were too, it wasn't that the pieces were too big, it was that they were so small, they kept getting stuck. And what the company did with this hematite ore is they made red paint. And I can't remember the name of the fellow that wrote the book about the town of Kirkland, but he tells us that most red barns in the United States were painted by paint using the pigment from the Clinton Metallic Paint Company. So anyway, those two lines that I showed you, the two curves, they're two of the smaller lines in the town of Kirkland. Getting back to the O&W, on the Rome branch, this was the first station. This is 3 pictures that I was very pleased to get when I was doing the book Rails Along the Oriskany. They'll probably be the only 3 pictures that we'll ever see of the station, and the only reason we're seeing it in these pictures was somebody took pictures of their family situated with the station. You can see the Kirkland station was nothing fancy. It was a board and batten structure. It was the smallest size made at the time, 20 by 40 in size. Its main claim to fame was the Clinton Iron Works that was just down the road from this. When you go to the Burn Dairy on Route 5, if instead of turning right to go to the Burn Dairy, if you turn left to where the Oriskany Creek goes underneath Route 5, that's where the Kirkland Iron Works was. Clark Mills was a railroad mecca. This is a map from the electrified third rail. And the reason that I call it a mecca was because Clark Mills had an O&W station. It had a New York Central station, which was built by the New York West Shore and Buffalo Railroad. When the New York West Shore and Buffalo Railroad was built in 1884, the New York Central took it over the following year. So essentially, it's always been a New York Central station. Then the Oneida Railway came along, and they electrified the West Shore Railroad between Utica and Syracuse by using an electrified third rail. And when they came to Clark Mills, they used the New York Central station, but they also built a tower, AK Tower, which was a 57 lever machine building. It was the second largest lever machine building on the electrified third rail. What do I mean by lever machine? In that building, there was a series of 56 different levers. So the operator could pull levers to change signals, to change switches, to direct trains one way or the other and give them clearance. This was high tech at the time. For Clark Mills to have a 56 lever machine, that was big business. The only other one was the Tower WU at New Hartford. Those were the only 2 biggest machines. And then of course, at Clark Mills, this is the powerhouse that the electrified third rail built. And I'm going to talk about all of these buildings in just a minute. This was the O&W station that was located in Clark Mills. Like all of the other stations on the Rome branch, it no longer is there. It was 30 feet wide by 60 feet long. It was the standard size for O&W stations at the time. If you go to Clark Mills today, you can locate where the station was because this church is still there. And you can stand in the spot and look to see the church, and then you'll know where the Clark Mills O&W Railroad Station was. The New York Central Station was not far distant from the O&W because the two railroads crossed in the town in Clark Mills. And you can see in the background, there's some freight cars here. They're on an interchange track between the two railroads. This was a standard design station for the New York West Shore Buffalo Railroad, whose architecture always had telegraph operator rooms up on the roof of the station. The 57 lever machine I told you about, this in this particular picture, it's just being finished. Its construction is almost done. And this would be in 1907. All of the levers that were in the machine were connected to the switches and signals by piping. So that is one of the reasons why they called lever machines Armstrong machines, because you had to have a little bit of an oomph behind you to move the lever, to move all the pipes, because sometimes the pipes might be 500, 700 feet long to get to where they had to work. The most interesting railroad building, in my opinion, was the power station for the electrified third rail. This was power station number 1. And that's because this was the building that received the 60,000 volts alternating current from the power supply on the Hudson River near Glens Falls. When the electrified third rail was being built in 1905 and 1906, there was not enough electricity to power the railroad. So the power company had to build its own new transmission line 100 miles long to go from the Hudson River to Clark Mills to bring enough power for the cars. And this is the building that 100-mile-long transmission line came to. And inside the building is all the apparatus that they needed for the operation of the third rail cars. This is a picture of the back of the building. This is the tower that received the 3-phase 60,000 volt alternating current. It went into the building underneath these hoods and came out of the building under these hoods, because all of the power stations, except the last one in Manoa, the power came into the building and then it went out of the building to go to the next building. And that was one of the things that this power station did. Its main thing was that it was the receiver of the power. So what went on, so this was the back of the station. This is what it looked like inside the power station. And all of the 4 power stations were identical. We have all of this equipment here. What is all this kind of stuff? Well, I'm no electrical engineer, but when I wrote my book about the electrified third rail, I met a fella who was an expert on all of this type of equipment. And the purpose of the building was not just to receive the 60,000 volts AC, but it was to convert the power to 600 volts DC for what the cars would need to run. The cars were run on a third rail system. There was a shoe on the side of the car that would pick up the electricity from the third rail that was on the side of the track. That's why they called it the third rail, because track normally has 2 rails, but with this type of electrification, they needed the third rail. So these gizmos right here are the rotary converters. They're the ones that did the job of converting the 60,000 volts to the DC. This is what's called, these are reactive coils, and these are transformers. Behind this wall is what they call the high tension room. The high tension room was, you didn't go in there because it was with that 60,000 volts floating around in there. You didn't want to be exposed to it, and that's why they had that wall with these glass partitions between them, okay? It might be hard for you to see, but there is knife switches right here and right there. These cabinets here are the cabinets that were used for the station operator to direct the power to certain tracks or to turn it off if maintenance had to be done. Well, the operator, when those cabinets, you can see they have dials on them, indicated that a train was coming into that territory and it needed more power. If he had to put out more power from the rotary converters, he would physically walk over and throw that knife switch. That was state-of-the-art technology back then. Nowadays, you'd have a little button, and they'd probably have a union contract that called for safety features so that the guy didn't have to worry about getting electrocuted by 600 volts DC. But that was state-of-the-art for the time. And this is a drawing that shows all of what we just talked about, with the rotary converters, the reactive coils, the transformers, and the high tension room. The high tension room was where the lines came in, gave their power to the coils, and then the power went back out to the next power station. Like Paul said, power station number 2 was at Sherrill, number 3 was at Canastota, and number 4 was at Manoa.
Yeah.
This is a picture of a pair of third rail cars passing the Clark Mills power station. It's been quite a few years since I did a program exclusively about the electrified third rail, but one of the most popularly asked questions was, how safe was that electrified third rail running through the countryside? Because if you touched it, there's a chance that you would get electrocuted. It was a safe system because it was what was called an underrunning third rail. And it had a wooden cover on the top of it. You could stand on the wooden cover, you could touch the wooden cover, but you wouldn't want to stand on the wooden cover or be on the ground and touch the bottom of the rail. That's when you would get electrocuted. You can never build anything like that today because people would be outraged that the railroads were building such a dangerous thing. But back when the Oneida Railway Company was in operation from 1907 to 1930, there wasn't one sober person that ever got killed from the electrified third rail. Unfortunately, there were a few fellas that had a bit too much to drink that fell down next to it. When they went to get up, they touched the third rail, and that was it. So it's another interesting anecdote. As long as you're sober, you're doing okay. This is the Clark Mills West Shore station during the time of the third rail. And you can see right here, the sign says Clark Mills Stop 6. All the stops were numbered sequentially from Utica to Syracuse. Stop 7 was where Stop 7 Road is today. People wonder how that name came about because that was where the shelter was. In this particular case, we see a steam-powered train being operated because folks from the Hine and Harrison company are going on an excursion to Sylvan Beach. So this special train is being run to take these folks to Oneida Castle, where they'll get on an O&W train, then to go up to Sylvan Beach. They could have also done it with the electrified third rail cars too, because the electrified third rail cars went to Oneida Castle. But this was an excursion that was set up between Hine and Harrison and the New York Central folks. This is another view of Clark Mills, a later day view. This is the crossing of the West Shore and the O&W. And right here was where AK Tower was. Here's the station, the West Shore station. This is the West Shore Freight House. The O&W station was behind this building, also where the church was. Hine and Harrison, I'm sure you all know, it was a fantastic manufacturing facility at one time. Somebody, Rose, could do a wonderful program on just Hine and Harrison. Who's the person?
Dick Williams already has done.
Okay, well that would be a good subject for a program. At Clinton, the Utica and Mohawk Valleys Clinton line, the number 3 line, terminated right here in Clinton. And when the cars came from Utica and New Hartford into Clinton, they had to cross the line of the Clinton Hematite Spur as well as the Franklin Iron Works Spur. And then they'd get to the park and they'd go around the park counterclockwise to stop, just like this car is doing here. And the reason they did that was so that people would get off the car on the park side and not on the street side. And by the way, this is where we are right now. We're in this church. Opening day for the Utica and Mohawk Valleys number 3 line was December 12th, 1901. That was the time period when all trolley lines were becoming electrified. If any trolley line was born as a horse-drawn trolley system, by the very earliest 1900s, it had to be electrified because it couldn't be competitive if it wasn't. And it was only because of a fellow by the name of Frank Sprague who developed all the apparatus that was needed to make the cars run. Frank Sprague was an electrical genius that we forget about. We think of Edison and Westinghouse and Tesla and all these other famous people, but Frank Sprague really is the forgotten innovator. And it was because of his designs that this picture was taken at the Clinton Park on opening day in 1901. By 1936, electrified trolley lines were failing every day. And the reason for that was because by then, roads were becoming modernized, cars were becoming reliable. We could drive more readily without having to rely on the schedule of a steam passenger train or an electric trolley car. 1936, for when this line was abandoned, is late. Most of them were abandoned by 1930 and 31. Back to the O&W at Franklin Springs, the original name for the community was the Franklin Iron Works, and that was because of the magnificent facility that once stood there, and you're going to see a picture of it in just a minute. Interestingly, though, in 1907, the O&W was building a new station at Franklin Springs. That was about the time that the Mineral Springs business began to usurp that of the Franklin Iron Works because Franklin Iron Works could not be competitive because of the lower grade hematite ore. They found the Mineral Springs, so Franklin Iron Works became known as Franklin Springs in 1906, and the O&W was building a new station in 1907 to get in on all this business. That same year, the Franklin Iron Manufacturing Company went out of business. So the O&W had a nice new station that it really could not use to the benefit that it really liked. This is Station Agent John Coleman right here. He's also buried in Sunset Hill Cemetery, and I have to tell you, if you want to have a hell of a good time looking for old railroad people connected to the town of Kirkland, walk around the Sunset Hill Cemetery sometime. You have to know who you're looking for, but there's a bonanza of them there. And then this picture shows the Franklin Springs station, and this structure behind it is the ramp that led to the storage building. That ramp led to this building, which had 3 tracks, and that was where the Franklin Iron Works and the Franklin Iron Manufacturing Company stored the ingredients that it needed to make iron. They got their ore from the mine. They brought that to the stockhouse. They also had to have limestone, and they had to have charcoal or coal. And those were the 3 ingredients that they would put into stacks. That's stack number 1. This is stack number 2. This is the elevator. That's the building. That's the elevator. They called it the charging tower, because what that did was it brought those 3 ingredients up from the storehouse, and it dropped it into the stack so that they could light the fire to begin the iron making process. Because once they got the fire going and they started the engines in the engine house that forced air into that fire, the fire got hot enough to melt all the ingredients together to make iron ore. I come from Munsville, that's where my station is. We used to have a place called the Munsville Plow Company. They made cast iron artifacts, culverts, culvert faces, plows, all different kinds of anything made of iron. Munsville Plow Company made it. They got their iron ingots from the Franklin Iron Works. And I'm sure that there was many, many other places that made it. The only problem for the Franklin Iron Works and the Franklin Iron Manufacturing Company was that the ore was only suitable for ornamental iron. It wasn't good for making high-grade iron or steel. And that was the downfall, so that by 1906 and 1907, the market changed. All the superior iron and steel manufactories out in the Midwest, in Minnesota, they cornered the market, and Franklin Iron Works could not remain in business. When you drive from Deansboro and you're coming into Clinton, you'll cross over the Oriskany Creek. There's a little fishing spot on the side of the road. When you're passing that spot, if you look to the north on the left-hand side of the road, that big empty lot there, that was where this building stood at one time. This was the largest manufacturer to ever lie on the line of the New York, Ontario, and Western Railways. It sounds hard to believe, but at one time, this facility, located in the town of Kirkland and in Clinton, even though they had the red dust from the hematite ore all over the streets and it got on people's laundry and everything else, this was big business. But by 1908, it had become a thing of the past. This is a picture of the inside of the Franklin Iron Works mine and the track leading to the mine, and that's one of the tracks that came off the O&W Railroad at Rome Branch Junction that I showed you earlier. The Clinton hematite mine was started by Charles Borst, and it was called the Modern Mine. He had all the modern equipment, modern for 1912, but certainly more modern than the Franklin Iron Manufacturing Company, which got its start in the 1880s. And you can see in the distance here, there are small hopper cars right here. This was the other mine that went to, the track went down to Rome Branch Junction. When this facility went into operation in 1903, it developed its own electric power station, and it provided power to the village of Clinton for a few hours every night so that people could have a little bit of electricity until more modern electrical facilities came along. This is a map of Rome Branch Junction that I showed you earlier. This is the line that went to the Franklin Iron Works. This is the other railroad that came along, crossed Utica Street, 12B, and then it swung around and crossed Broomfield Street, where there was a tail track. And then the trains would come up, and then they would go this way to the Clinton Hematite Mine. When you turn off of 12B onto Broomfield Street, you'll go up the road a little bit, and all of a sudden it'll turn to the left, and there's a flat spot right there. That flat spot is right here. That's one of the railroads that used to have in the town of Kirkland. The Clinton Metallic Paint Company was the third hematite business in Clinton. It never had its own railroad, but it did have its mine that operated until 1964. There's a fellow that used to live in Knoxborough. His name was Sam Terrier, and I talked with him a few times, and he was one of the last miners for the Clinton Metallic Paint Company. He was working there from the late 1950s until it closed in 1964. He says, what a great place to work. I said, it was? You're working underground all the time. He says, oh, but he says, we were making such good money. He says, we had a quota every day. We had to mine so much ore. But there were 5 or 6 of them, I forget just how many. And they always worked hard to make their quota, and then anything else they made, they got paid extra for. He says at the time, we were making more money than anybody. He says it was a great place to work. I guess money's everything, just like it is today. Oh, come on. All right, here we go, okay. By the 1940s, of course, the O&W was on its last legs. The O&W, of course, was Clinton's and the town of Kirkland's favorite railroad, I would have to say. And you might have heard the story that during this period in the mid to late 1940s, there was a town of Kirkland, a Hamilton College president. I can't think of his name offhand, but he got a letter from a student that wanted to attend the college. And the student said, oh boy, he wants to come to Hamilton College in the worst way. And the president of the college, his advice was, take the O&W. The O&W was a railroad that you embraced because you knew that it had failings, just like human beings. We have good times, we have bad times, there's some good people, there's some bad people. Well, the O&W is one of those underdogs that you just had to always root for. By 1948, the line to Rome looked like this as the train was getting ready to cross Route 5. And at Franklin Springs, where this train is passing the site of the Franklin Iron Works, which was off on the side here, you can see there's grass growing up between the rails, and the railroad had been in a bankruptcy for 11 years by this time, and there was no way that it was going to happen because aside from the stone quarry at Oriskany Falls, there really was no business on the line anymore. Steam engines went and diesel locomotives came. This is one of the O&W's diesel engines, and it's passing the freight house that had at this time become the station, because when the station was sold and torn down in 1944, this building became the station. Its historical footnote is that when Clinton was celebrating its 100th anniversary in 1887, and President Grover Cleveland came to Clinton to help celebrate the event, the big celebration was held inside that building. I guess because it was one of the largest buildings in Clinton that could accommodate so many people. So even though the building is not in its site today, and it's used as a garage housing for the Clinton apartments, it still is a historic building dating back to the days of the railroad, and in its own way it's helping to perpetuate the memory of the railroad. Last runs, the Oneida Railway Company stopped running December 31st, 1930. The line number 3, as you saw, ended in 1936. The O&W abandoned March 29, 1957, and the West Shore Railroad that had been the Oneida Railway Company earlier, 1964. So since 1964, you have not had a wheel turning on the rails in the town of Kirkland. This is the scrapping of the O&W Railroad at Clark Mills. The track running left to right is the West Shore. This is the O&W, and these fellas, they're taking up the track. That's what's going on here. They're putting rails into these cars. They have machinery that's being pulled by a locomotive that's doing that. One of the enduring stories is that when these scrappers came to Clark Mills to take up the O&W tracks, there was the interchange track between the two railroads that I pointed out earlier where there were freight cars on. Well, there was a freight car sitting there on that track. So what did these guys know? They took up the rails on both sides of it, left the car sitting there high and dry. When the New York Central came along to pick up their car, they couldn't get to it. And things like that happen frequently. Another interesting story, and I hope you don't mind me being a little long-winded, but I think you've gotten to the point that you know when you're coming to see one of my programs, you know that I'm not going to mince words. On the Lehigh Valley line that used to go from Canastota to Camden, when it was abandoned in 1938, the scrappers were taking up the track just like they're doing here at Clark Mills. They got to McConnellsville, and there was a siding there, so they took up the siding, then they took up the main track and kept going and got to Canastota, and everything was fine and dandy. All the tracks were gone. In the Lehigh Valley offices, one day they got a call from a woman from McConnellsville. She said, "How come you took up my track?" The guy says, well, what do you mean? She says, "Well, when they came through and they took up all the rails, they took up my siding." She says, "My husband paid for that siding for the McConnellsville Sand Company." She says, it was our property, they shouldn't have taken it up. So the guy said, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" She says, "Well, there's another railroad in town, maybe I'll connect up to that." She made them put the siding back in. Never used it again, but good for her. She put the railroad in its place. This is a milepost that sits sort of kitty corner on the other side of the park from here, near where the railroad station used to be. And the sign on it says, "The first train on the Utica, Clinton, and Binghamton Railroad reached Clinton September 3rd, 1866. And then the last train of the O&W Railroad ran on March 29th, 1957. Like most historical signs, it's not quite right. So whenever you see these blue and yellow signs along the side of the road, they're good general signs, but in this particular case, this should say, "The first train of the Utica City Railroad reached Clinton September 3rd, 1866. And if it said that, then this sign would be accurate. Nobody's going to know the difference. If I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know the difference. In the scheme of things, it's small potatoes. But God damn it, as a historian and somebody who writes books about these kinds of things, I like to see as much accuracy as I can. I'm sure during the course of this program, I might have misspoken a little bit too. if you go to the Town of Kirkland Library and you get a copy of the Rails of London Risky to read, you'll read it and you'll say, well, this isn't what he was talking about in the program. So believe what you read in the book, because I might have made some mistakes too.